Sometimes the games that you're playing in League really are decided to a certain degree by the champions that you and your team choose. And that idea kind of works in multiple ways. Picking really good champions is obviously a good thing, unlike my voice cracks. But in the reverse sense, picking bad champions is also a very bad thing. And to give a direct example, I know somebody in Grandmaster and Challenger who always bans Ezreal. And they don't ban Ezreal because they hate playing against him. They hate playing with Ezreal. Today's video is going to be entirely dedicated to going over champions that you need to be avoiding in your games, either by banning it to make sure that your allies don't play it as long as they're not hovering it, otherwise that would be breaking the summoner's code, and you yourself not playing them because they're either in a really bad spot or simply not worth all the effort that you have to put in. And there's examples of both in today's video. I'm also going to include tips on how to abuse these champions if you're up against them because they're on the enemy team. Because 9 times out of 10, if you do what I'm going to tell you, you'll be able to absolutely destroy them and win the game no problem. If you actually learned something today, make sure you like the video, that way I know what you learned, and while you're at it, comment so I know exactly what it was. And at that point, you may as well subscribe to catch up with our other guys as we move forward on the patch. Don't forget our website guides either, where we get to go super in depth on just about any topic related to League in order to teach you how to be an amazing League player. And everything up there is done by Challenger level players as well, so you should definitely check it out. To start everything off, I'm going to bring the champion who was just recently released into the spotlight. And no, I'm not actually talking about Yone, because he's not quite out yet. I'm talking about Lillia, because Lillia is truly in an awful spot. And unless you are just absolutely feeling like you are completely compelled to learn and understand Lillia, then you really shouldn't be trying to put any time into her, because she is in serious need of some assistance. And this goes for Lillia in all roles that she's viable. I've seen her play top, I've seen her play mid and jungle, and even somebody tried to play her support once in a game that I had played. At the end of the day, it's really hard to find a solid redeeming quality that Lillia has in order to make her viable. So to hit the high points on her, on how to really destroy her, even though she's already pretty bad, her weaknesses to CC are definitely really apparent because the only thing she has is mobility, but it's not really mobility, you're just getting movement speed. So if you manage to close the distance and really get on top of her and stop her from moving, that seriously cripples her. A really good example of this would be a Jarvan ulti, making it so that Lillia really can't move around the battlefield in a way that she would want. Her most pronounced weakness is being zone controlled and not allowed to get in ranges that are optimal for her, where she isn't getting empowered Qs on people, she isn't hitting multiple people to sleep multiple people, and she simply can't make use of her catching potential. With that solid warning of Lillia out of the way, let me move on to a champion who's more dedicated in the support role but definitely has seen plays in the mid and top. Riot claimed that they were trying to nerf Karma solely for pro play, but in this case, I'm really not buying it, and you shouldn't either. Because nerfing something's cooldown by 2 full seconds is actually a really big deal. And if you don't believe me on that one, think about the buff to Zed recently. While it's a different ability and a different champion, he got 2 seconds buffed on his W. And that took him from a champion who was kinda in the middle of the pack to almost top tier. Karma really is a champion that is suffering right now no matter what role she's played in. And if you can, I highly recommend that you avoid her, because she really is losing her ability to contest with other supports in lane because she's simply losing out on damage over time. While she's still able to poke occasionally, it's not going to be the type of pressure that she's had in the past. In order to really counter Karma, you're looking for hard CC and hard engage, because Karma's movement speed and her ability to regain lots of health with her RW makes it very difficult for truly tanky champions that don't have incredible engage to deal with her. A solid example of this would be a Jarvan not being all that effective against a Karma because he's effectively just fodder for her RW, and while he can restrict her to movement only inside of his R when she doesn't have flash, sometimes that's not enough. And if you're playing Jarvan just to ulti the enemy Karma, what are you doing anyways? People with really solid pick potential, very high AoE damage, and the ability to CC Karma in multiple ways are very solid into her, because they can always disrupt her and never allow her to really truly support her allies all across the map. Now let's shuffle things up a bit and move on into the jungle for a moment here and talk about Sejuani. This champion really used to be one of the best junglers in the game. She truly has fallen from grace, and it really is just due to repeated nerfs. She lost a bunch of damage, she lost some CC, she lost some mobility, and right now, with what's present in the meta, she just can't compete. You should definitely look to avoid Sejuani. And if you are playing against her, then know that she's actually very, very weak in her first jungle clear. So if you ever have any ability to poke at her when she's getting leashed at level 1, or invade her, spot her out with wards even, it can allow you and your teammates to really be able to play around her. Because if she isn't getting ahead, she's going to feel underwhelming. Even in her prime, Sejuani was a champion who did require at least some kind of a lead to really feel effective. Back then, it was because she was really, really great at clearing, had very, very solid ganks, and could also 1v1 most other junglers. Now, that's just simply not the case. Like I said, it's really, really easy to punish her in early levels, and a great example of one of the best times to run into a Sejuani is when she's on a crab, because it means that she doesn't have any of her cooldowns up, and her cooldowns in the early game are actually very, very long. With our next champion, we aren't really leaving the jungle, but he is able to fill multiple roles other than the jungle. Sett is played in the jungle and support, as well as top lane, and even to a certain degree in the mid lane. And just to cover all my bases, he is technically sometimes played in the AD carry position with really big air quotes. But the fact of the matter is that Sett is just not really doing too hot right now. The only place that he's even remotely redeemable is in the top lane, because the nerfs to his E and his W that he experienced on this patch really hurt Sett in both the jungle and in support. And for the most part, they also had a profound impact on the mid lane, because mid lane Sett usually always built full tank. The reason my top lane didn't kind of feel it too much is because he doesn't usually max W or E, and you usually go for full damage. The real problem is that it hurts Sett scaling, no matter what ability he tries to max second, and in some cases it even hurts him in the early game. And that's a big problem, because Sett is usually a champion who looks to gain a lead in the early game and then dominate with that lead. And when you're pulling the rug out from under him on some of his damage numbers, especially as he's trying to win in the mid game, then it's proving to actually be a problem no matter where he's going, even if it's less of a problem in some cases than others. Sett really is being left out to dry, and especially with several other laners who can challenge him early on getting buffs, it really is leaving him in an awful spot where you should definitely try to avoid him. If you're playing into him, no matter what role you're looking at, just try to avoid fighting him in the early game as much as possible. His W shield just has so much value, and if you do manage to get a good trade, always keep in mind when that haymaker is going to pop out, and make sure you dodge it, because dodging the big true damage hit really makes a massive difference in lane. He's going to have better health regen than you no matter what health he is at, so be careful when you're initiating in short rapid trades. If you're not coming out on top by a pretty significant margin, then they aren't worth it and you shouldn't try to take those trades again. And like I said, Sett usually wants to dominate with a big lead, and if you never even give him that lead in the first place, then he doesn't get to do that. Now let's just deja vu gear shift here into the mid lane. And at this point, this one might seem a little bit overdone, but I just have to do it, because I have to clarify. I'm going to be talking about Akali here. While Akali definitely is, in some cases, getting a net buff, you really got to consider what's really powerful in the meta right now, and the ways that that buff can be directly countered. Let me set up a quick scenario for you. Because Akali's E no longer does physical damage in the early game, anybody in the universe who buys magic resist before she gets a void staff now is going to take way less damage than they did before. And guess what? Most people in a lane against Akali are taking magic resist in their minor runes, so it's actually hurting Akali's early game damage. And that's a problem, because Akali is a champion who fundamentally needs to be snowballing at least a little bit. If you aren't ahead, it can sometimes feel like it's impossible to get anything done. Even more so when a champion like Galio is one of, if not the best mid laners around right now. Even if you're pulling things up into the top lane where Akali can have some good matchups, you're still looking at the fact that her early game damage does get diminished because her E no longer does physical. And when you've got really big boy tanks who can just easily tank all of her damage, and now that it's all magical, and even some bruisers that do well into her because of specific mechanics like Fiora's Q auto-aiming on Akali in her Shroud, or the ability to block auto attacks like Jax, you really just aren't left with anything else to do. If you're playing against Akali, make sure that you avoid the quick short trades that she tries to take all the time. And be careful of her Q range, because if you get hit with it at max range, you're gonna probably get smacked by a follow-up auto attack that's gonna chunk you for a lot of your health. A key thing for playing against Akali is wave manipulation, so that you can hold the wave near you and trying to freeze it as best as you can. because if you do that, it forces Akali to try and break it by casting her abilities, and when she wastes energy on her abilities, then she's going to be overextending and potentially even not have her shroud as he tries to use it to push the wave even faster. This can allow you to get really nice trades off, or even maybe bait her for a gank. And if Akali has to basically permanently play up at risk because you're playing the lane correctly, then her life is just going to suck. Another mid laner who's really in a bit of a rough spot right now as they've received nerf after nerf is Syndra. She got mana cost nerfs, now she's getting damage nerfs, she's had cooldown nerfs before. This champion really is just on a downward spiral, at least in the eyes of Riot. Like I said, Syndra was already in a pretty rough spot, but now it's even more so. You're getting damage and early trades affected, you're getting your wave clear in the middle stages of the game affected. This becomes a really big problem for Syndra until she gets a massive amount of items to overcome the difference. And setting her behind like that might not seem like too big of a deal, but sometimes that's just all you need for the lane to turn in somebody else's favor. It's gotten to the point where now it's actually really effective to try and fight Syndra early on, because she will simply run out of mana as quick as she possibly can, trying to trade back with you frantically. 5, 10, 15, or even 20 damage might not seem like a lot, but think about how many Qs Syndra throws out in a given lane. That can add up really quickly, especially when you consider that you're using this at least 10 times a minute. So if you manage to have some way to survive her poke, or even just dodge a lot of it and create a ton of chaos in the lane where she has to respond by burning more and more mana, you can really make her feel useless and literally be useless very quickly. The last champion I'm going to go over is going to be in the bot lane, but first I need to cover one more mid laner, and that's LeBlanc. LeBlanc has always been a mid laner that takes a pretty high amount of skill, as addressing when exactly to mirror what ability is a challenge in and of itself, as well as knowing how to really abuse the ranges on her kit and the timings on her kit were always super important to really making her work. The difficulty of getting an early lead on her aside, it can become really hard to play the game as LeBlanc when you have enemies throwing out CC faster than you can respond. Sure, sometimes you'll be able to dash over a wall with your W or a mimicking W on R and be completely safe from whatever they're throwing at you. But in the case where point-and-click long CCs are pretty common, and the ability for people to close distances or create distances being pretty common, LeBlanc just doesn't feel as powerful anymore. With a lot of other mid laners getting nerfed in some ways, she is on the rise, but that doesn't mean that she's risen to the point where she actually is good yet. If you're a LeBlanc player, your time is coming, but it isn't now. One of LeBlanc's worst weaknesses is the fact that she has to rely on her W a lot in order to either do damage or escape. Once you understand the range of her W, you can really easily begin to trade around her and even bait her into some really bad scenarios. Because, like I said, LeBlanc does need to be a snowball champion, and if you aren't ever really in her grasp, she's going to feel forced to come to you and start leading trades off with her W. If your champion happens to have high range, you might even be able to just force her to use her W solely for the mobility to try and get on top of you. This can be really powerful because you're setting up situations where you could throw skill shots over back to her W and predict her really easily, because she knows that she has to leave, otherwise she's overextending and is going to be like almost under your tower. That's pretty much the dream scenario when you're up against LeBlanc, where you can play outside of her W range and deal damage to her at the same time. For the rest of the champions though, who don't really get to have that luxury, a lot of the time it's about understanding how to dodge LeBlanc's E. If she isn't landing it, she's almost never going to kill you. The root and the ability to have a reliable proc for her Q's second detonation damage is really massive. And the reason why LeBlancs are going to have to do that to you is because, like I said earlier, you shouldn't be playing in her W range, let alone her QW range, because that's just you giving her free damage. And as long as you avoid that, LeBlanc's going to be in a really tough spot, where she's basically forced to make plays that are impossible. Now, the very last champion that I mentioned earlier, the AD carry that you really want to be avoiding right now, is actually Varus. You might have thought it would have been Kai'Sa, given how many of you guys actually point her out on all of the tier list videos that we do, but right now Varus is actually proving to be even worse than I thought he was going to be. The problem with Varus is that he's lost a lot of his early game edge, and when he can no longer suffocate out other laners, it becomes really difficult to justify picking him, because that's his main strength. Varus isn't all that great of a scaler when compared to other champions, and right now, compared to the other early game AD carries that exist, he doesn't really beat them out either. At that point, you might be considering, well, aren't you picking Varus for the R potential, where you can engage fights without people really realizing that there's a lot of danger around? And yeah, that's true, but that's probably why he's winning the amount of games that he is, because that's the only thing that he really has left. While some of the nerfs that he has received in recent patches were really aimed at lethality Varus, because they were touching things like ratios and total damage numbers, it really does still have an effect on the attack speed Varus, because it's not like you can remove an ability from his kit when you're playing him the different style. So with those problems in mind, and his mid-game ultimate engage potential being the one, let's say, redeeming factor, why wouldn't you just pick something like Ashe? Varus has similar weaknesses, but just not as many strengths. If you're playing against the Varus, his early game is actually considerably weak when the base damage on his E got nerfed and his overall Q scaling also got hit. So abusing him in early levels if possible is always a good thing that you want to try and do. And this is even worse for him considering that he really doesn't have a way to sustain. While it can be really hard to truly shut him out from farm because his Q range is so long, zoning him from farm can still create opportunities where you can dive on top of him because his lack of mobility and lack of real CC in the early game makes it so that even if he only has to overextend a little bit, that can be all you need to actually kill him. Since he has no mobility and no real CC, like I had said, it's also very effective to just hard engage on top of him, to the point where he explodes before he can actually do anything. And while he might have flash in certain scenarios to escape CC or some tanks going on top of him, assassins and even long-range burst mages can just have a field day against him, being able to contest with his range on his Q while also simultaneously always posing a risk to him if he ever tries to enter a fight. With that, let me just remind you one last time, seriously, do yourself a favor and try to avoid picking these champions. And if you're playing against them, make sure you abuse them in the way that I described in the video. Hopefully this gives you a leg up on the competition, and moving forward it should also help you even more as we go through more patches where different champions are suffering in different ways. To find more guides that are similar to this one, make sure you go check out our website as well, where we have tons of videos that are all made by challenger level players on just about any topic that you could ever need to improve at League. We've got champion guides that get to go even more in depth than the ones we have here on YouTube, as well as generic guides for skills that are really important to the fundamental basics of League, and lane-specific guides for whatever you're looking for. And as always, my name is Ace Windstorm, and I will see you all later.